Okay, so we're here to talk about raising great kids in the digital age, how to harness the technology for good, not evil, basically, but how to harness the technology. And I want to give you a couple quick points that if you want to get the most of this webinar, if at all possible, grab your favorite drink, relax, take some notes, doodle, do what you need to do. But the fact of the matter is, the more you're able to focus on this, the more you'll get out of it. So for anyone who's brand new, I'm Jacqueline Green, parenting coach, educator, and speaker since the year 2000, and really started because of my children and needing help. Started the Great Parenting Show in 2010. And I've been featured in various media, and now I'm starting to do more in-person speaking now that my daughter's in her grade 12 or senior year. Once upon a time, I began as a struggling parent, really. I began, though, first with gazing into my firstborn, my son's eyes, and vowing to be the best parent possible. Unfortunately, like way too many parents nowadays, I found myself very quickly battling. He was colicky. I found myself, like most parents nowadays, with very little support, and battling depression, anger, and really, really struggling, really horrified by my own behavior. And that started me on a very powerful journey, because I was just so crystal clear that what I was doing was not okay. Screaming at a little kid is not okay. My kids, of course, when you've got a parent, even though I like to talk about it sometimes as a Jekyll and Hyde situation, 95% of the time I was a very devoted, dedicated parent, but unfortunately every once in a while I blew it. And those times, if you can think of someone in your life who every once in a while blows it, and a lot of people who have aggression issues are too nice the rest of the time. They've got boundary issues and then blow it, and I definitely was having that problem. Of course, chicken and egg, but a lot of times parenting issues erode family dynamics, and I definitely, co-parenting issues were massive issues for me, and sometimes I get more into that for sure. I share those things because I was blessed to get on the path much less traveled, but much, like, crazily more effective. Parents nowadays, you're spending way too much time and energy on parenting. You should not have to do 24/7 parenting. I like to talk about a guy on Huffington Post live with me on an interview, and he was talking about doing 1-on-1D with his kids, that him and his wife decided to only have 2 children. It's insanity. We wouldn't exist as a species and have thrived, at any rate, as a species if it was like that all the time. So I got on this dramatically easier path. And so despite the fact, I sometimes talk about how low my marriage got. And in the 3 years since I've left, it's continued to be very, very challenging, leaving somebody who, my marriage included going at one point to a woman's shelter with the kids and staying away for 4 months in order to get the physical aggression to end. And yet I have these 2 wonderful children who are thriving and who really show me regularly the evidence of their caring, empathetic beings, and yet they're also very bright, and both are doing very well academically. My daughter's been touted as valedictorian, and my son is applying now for the honors program in his course in college. The point of sharing all this is, so many of you, I know, parenting has not turned out the way you've expected, and I want you to know, been there, done that, and you can get to where you want to be regardless of how things are right now. And digital issues are undermining parenting in an alarming rate, because parenting was already challenging enough in the last, say even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, things had changed enough that it was already very challenging. So I want you to be crystal clear that it is so far from hopeless that you can get there as well. So I'd love for those of you who haven't yet commented about why you're here. What is it you're most hoping to get from this talk today, and what are your biggest concerns? And again, as I said, like, even just writing these things down is going to help you deepen your learning. And so I really encourage you to interact. What I'm going to cover today, the basic points are why digital issues are so important. I'm going to go into that in a little bit of detail. Some about the ways to harness the positives, and it's not the biggest section because I'm so clear that parents are aware of, within ways to harness the positives. I will get into some ways you're not aware of, but I won't get into a lot about the positives aspect of technology overall, because people are quite clear that technology has benefits. But if you don't know how to harness the positives without tapping into all the negatives, you get yourself in a lot of trouble. So I'll talk more about that. And finally, what to do with kids who may already be addicted, because some of you no doubt are here because your kids already are showing lots of signs of issues with media and digital addictions. So why digital issues are so important, I'm going to talk about three main things. What some of the causes are for alarm, how digital issues are changing parenting, because there's some really profound, important changes to be aware of, and a little bit about our own digital issues. And I want to emphasize with this is a huge topic, could easily be a 6-week course. So I'm highlighting a lot of different information. I'm going to give you information at the end about where to get more information. And I will, talk fast, cover a lot of information. The hope is to point you in the right direction, and then there will be a chance to ask me questions later, and we can interact, through Facebook and other methods. I'm willing to certainly continue to further the discussion. So, cause for alarm, some of the highlights. One, some information from an American Academy of Pediatrics study that's interesting is average, and this was 2010, so almost 7+ years ago, or 7 years ago now, average 8 to 10-year-olds 8 hours a day with different media. Just shocking when you see how it adds up. Older children and teens 11 hours a day. 2/3 of families have no rules for their kids with technology. So just a few alarming things when we get further and layer this to what this type of quantity of media does to our children. 50% of teens say they go online almost constantly. And interestingly enough, the American Academy of Pediatrics says they recommend and have for some time no TV for kids under 2 and over 2, only 1 hour a day, and at most 2 hours, and yet 32 hours is the norm. So it's really disturbing, to say the least. Dimitris Christiakis is one of many people who have documented some of the dramatic changes, and he's actually a pediatrician who was alarmed after having children at what he saw going on. Back in 1970, the girl on the left, maybe a 6-year-old, or even say maybe she's a 4-year-old, but the long and short is 1970. Your child was walking, talking, etc. before they were exposed to media. Today, you're speaking like very, very little children. And yeah, yet another stat that I had down here is that typical children under 5, 40% of their waking hours, they're saying that 4.5 hours is typical for the amount of media use. So are we overreacting? Like what's the big deal? Children, here's a few stats again. Children who watch 8 hours of television a day were 200% more likely to become bullies in one study. 4-year-olds who watch 3.5 hours of TV a day were 25% more likely to exhibit cruelty and meanness to others. And that doesn't mean there's not other things going on for that 4-year-old, because we'll get into that in a moment. It adds up very quickly, the media time. And many studies are showing things like lowered academic performance, earlier sexual activity, earlier drug and alcohol use, lots of negative attitudes that are created by all this media consumption. Preschoolers who watch TV are actually rated, again, this is another study, that they're rated as less creative by their teachers than the preschoolers who did not watch TV. Another stat about the more TV before the age 3 has been directly linked in many studies to more attention problems. So a little bit about all this media consumption adds up to an issue with overstimulation of brains, right? And it is so sad, because I know one of the many reasons why so many children are watching so much TV or consuming digital media is because of how overwhelmed parents are, and a lot of times it can seem like a great alternative when you need a little bit of help. But unfortunately, there's many costs to your child's brain when they get overstimulated. are less interested in novel learning opportunities, and a lot of times start associating novel learning, learning and are engaged and think what's interesting is online media. Overstimulation affects brains. Studies are showing more risk-taking. Many studies, and this is just over and over and over again, attention issues come through in so many different studies and so many different media, different articles, different studies, etc., talk about the huge issue with attention. Content also matters, and this one's a really interesting one because at the same time that our kids are consuming a lot more media than they used to, the content of that media is also changing. So even just speaking of television, and we're going to get in just a second into interactive versus passive media, which is more serious and damaging. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Rogers, they show a zero increase in attention issues. And of course, those of you who remember Mr. Rogers or are familiar with it, Mr. Rogers was very slow paced, right? And kind of just a slow older man, and not at all something that would fly nowadays on TV. Typical cartoons, now they're showing a 60% increase in attention issues with those who consume them. Violence shows 110% increase in their attention issues when they're watching that type of violent shows. And cartoons, it's wild, the dramatic increase in the amount of cuts and changes and the amount of violence, unfortunately, in them. Again, some more issues associated. I mentioned the attention issues, things like obesity, because unfortunately the lack of movement, cyberbullying, sexting, and things like that. Kids not developing or maturing as rapidly, lots of links with socio and emotional, and maturation not happening as it used to. Addictions, and this is interesting, not just the addiction of the digital technology itself, but also other addictions. So I'll talk more about that later. So here's one of the times I really want each of you to write in to the chat box. Which do you think is worse, interactive or passive media? And as part of answering that question, which one do you think is more addicting? Which one do you think causes sleep issues, leads to trouble concentrating, and increased irritability? And it's not a trick question, but it's great to get out there what you where your bench line is, because most parents, like absolutely, the chat starting to come in, and passive media is what most parents think is the worst media. And unfortunately, we've got that exactly backwards, which is why it's so critical to understand. The interesting thing is passive media is shown to be less addicting. It causes less sleep issues, even though I gave the example of television earlier for troubles with concentrating and the links there. The fact of the matter is passive media is not near as engaging. And I do see some people are saying interactive, which is great, because that is a consciousness that we need to get out there. Because in order to be addictive, we need something that's much more engaging. And it's not that we have not seen people who glued in front of a television too, but interactive media is significantly more addictive. Electronic screen syndrome is something I want to talk about, and the interactive versus passive media, it's one of the pieces that Dr. Victoria Dunkley, who's coined the phrase electronic screen syndrome, is really working on getting the word out there about how much more addicting interactive media is. Electronic screen syndrome is when your child has a hyperarousal of their sensitive nervous system, and unfortunately it can become a pattern, creating dysfunction in school, at home, or in social relationships. Unfortunately, the most vulnerable are boys, younger children, and kids with pre-existing psychological conditions or developmental learning and or behavior disorder. Unfortunately, it's a real cause and effect type of situation, because those people who already are, have a problematic family history and or youthful initial exposure to screen time, and that's the sad thing. So many extremely dedicated families understanding that media is important and wanting their kids to be current are exposing their children to way too much screen time, too young, too much, and ending up causing their children to be more vulnerable. High amounts of total lifetime exposure have also been linked as precursors to the having kids with the pre-existing psychological conditions, developmental learning, and or behavior disorders. So an interesting thing too is I'm just going to list like the symptoms of ESS. If you think of nowadays, there's so many kids out there who do have ADD. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but in the last 10 years, there's been a 50% rise in the number of kids who have ADD, and aggression issues are so dramatically on the rise. They're just horrifying levels of aggression that parents are really struggling with figuring out how to deal with. And unfortunately, a lot of them, Dr. Dunkley has done a lot of work with families and teaching them how to wean their children and then kind of reintroduce media after a time of abstinence, because that gives the kids a reset. And it's just crazy, the symptoms that go away. So she strongly recommends that if you've got kids or having had serious issues, that you look at taking a short screen fast, a time without screens at all, in order to see if these type of symptoms diminish or go away altogether. ESS symptoms include irritability, depression, changing moods, lower frustration points. And this lower frustration point is so crazy because your child actually, or anyone who has this electronic screen syndrome problem, they have lower frustration tolerance. At the same time, they're actually more stressed. So they've got more stress and more things they're frustrated about at the same time that their frustration is lower. So it leads to explosive kids very quickly. Poor self-regulation. So those same kids, lower frustration points, more stress, and poor self-regulation. So things like oppositional defiant behaviors, definite social immaturity, poor eye contact. Those of you who've heard me talk more about alignment, that's a real key. And I'm going to say a little bit high level about alignment today, because that's really the hidden invisible force that for eons, for centuries, we could count on and made our kids want to listen to us. And eye contact helps dramatically with alignment. So it's a big deal when you lose that. Insomnia, huge issues with kids having problems sleeping, learning difficulties, short-term memory, tics, stuttering, etc. Like just crazy. At the same time, ESS can exacerbate psychiatric, neurological, behavioral, and learning disorders, and thus help to account for that higher incidence of ADHD. And I already said that there's been, over the last 10 years, over a 50% increase in the incidence of childhood ADHD. And the interesting thing is, in some children, what she's found is that very small amounts of electronic media can trigger ESS. Some children are a lot more able to withstand screens and not have issues, and some have really low trigger points. One of the huge things too, and again, I've got to be careful not to get ahead of myself, but the age that you introduce things really does matter, and the exposure and the quantity of exposure at different ages. So here's a little bit about the addictiveness. So when you think again of that passive versus the interactive, the passive media does not release near as much dopamine. And dopamine is a chemical that our brain is designed to, it's like a reward system, and it is something that our children are designed to be more receptive to dopamine. Children and teens are. Children and teens' brains are that much more plastic than adults, because historically, in order to be able to adapt to whatever environment the child was in, they needed to be more novel seeking. The problem is with those more receptive dopamine receptors and the way that games and online interactive media feed and give dopamine hits, it makes it that much more addictive. Those of you who've heard my interview with Dr. Dan Siegel, and it is available on the website, we got into the fact that those brains are really designed to be more plastic. Ultimately, it's a good thing, but it backfires big time when something like media gets introduced. And the sad thing about media, all the digital screens that have come into our lives is they've come so quickly that parents are caught flat-footed, having no idea what to do. The brains of kids who game 20 hours a week are just like the brains of alcoholic and drug addicts, like just scary. And the percentage of kids who say that they're addicted, I'd love for you to put in the chat box what you think that the percentage of kids who say that they're addicted. It's shocking that 50% of kids say they're addicted. And sorry, I'm realizing in this case, I'm not sure. I believe this is teens, but I don't have the exact age bracket that this study is from. So short-term versus long-term, it is another one of the things. Again, I'm not going to say very much more, but I wanted to highlight some of the things that there's real concerns that in the short term, in the versus the long term, both though, the concern is that your frontal lobe, your prefrontal cortex, which if you could see me right now, I'm holding up my hand, you're just to my forehead area, the area just behind your eyes and your forehead is where your prefrontal lobe is. It's your higher thinking brain, your decision making, etc., and it dramatically inhibits that prefrontal lobe. So in the short term, there are, as I had said, there are concerns with things like mood, cognitive ability to think, basically, and sleep. In the longer term, real big concerns about maturation, potential for relationships because of lower maturation, lower social emotional intelligence, things like career, dramatic effects in the long term, because studies have shown that brain damage can result in addicted gamers, for example. And we are going to talk about games because games are not necessarily a bad thing. Interactive media is not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is the quantity and the addictive nature of it. So how digital issues are changing parenting, really it gives your children three things that are a concern. One is the ability to connect to each other. Another is the ability to entertain themselves, and the third one is to get information. And all of those can seem like positive things, and they can be harnessed in a positive way, but there's a dark side or downside. So why does it matter that they can connect with each other? In order to know that and understand, you need to know what gives you, historically, has always given parents the power to parent, the natural ability to get your children to listen to you. This is alignment, and I talk about this alignment. It is the most studied theory in all of developmental psychology. I'm actually referring to attachment theory, which is not the same as attachment parenting at all. There's some really critical distinctions there. I won't get into this in much detail at all, but alignment, I intentionally call it alignment, not attachment, because of the confusion with attachment parenting, where people think that you have to do certain practices. You don't even have to breastfeed ever, even though I do recommend it. You don't have to do it ever in order to be a great parent with alignment in mind and harness attachment theory. But it's the connection or line that makes us want to cooperate with and or behave like or for another. Very critical that you learn more about alignment. We never used to have to know, but unfortunately, you really do have to know about alignment nowadays, because it's like gravity suddenly quit working for us, and we have to therefore know how to harness this. So why does it matter? Digital access have a big impact on alignment. Again, if you go back to those three things that kids can do, they can connect to each other now in ways that just unheard of before. They can entertain themselves, and they can get information. The interesting thing is they used to be driven to seek us for all of these things, and that made us, like, literally, you go back 100 years and there was almost no one else your kids could align with to any depth than their parents. And so parents didn't have to know a thing about alignment because they could count on it. And you can have kids do wonderfully despite having screen access, but you have to really watch their age and have some knowledge of whether or not their alignment needs are being met by you so that they can stay connected with you while still being in connection with others. So yeah, I love to get into this in great detail because our instincts are so off, because we know historically we've always been able to count on alignment, and so we do so many things to actually knock our kids out of alignment besides just what digital media does as well. So it's a very serious issue. But so why does it matter that our kids can connect to each other? The fact of the matter is that what our digital media is it's really so many of our technologies and so many of our screens are designed to help us to connect to each other. So they're like an alignment or a relationship tool, but it's being used to connect or align with others. So that's why we've got the crazy situation of kids who are the equivalent of psychologically malnourished. Well, in these families with like this guy, I was a co-interviewee on the Huffington Post Live, and him and his wife are doing one-on-one D with his kids. But the fact of the matter is, if they give their kids access to screens too quickly and don't know how to harness the positives and keep their kids in line, those kids can be psychologically malnourished in their own home. And the reason for the malnourishment part is that other children, unfortunately, are not able to give them what they need psychologically. They can give them the superficial alignment, but they can't give them the core, deeper alignment that they crave. Children learn from those that they are aligned with. And if they're, again, I'm being really careful not to get into this because it's a 6-week plus course on its own. The fact of the matter is that your children, if they are picking up things naturally from you and taking your lead and taking direction from you, well, it's a sign they're very aligned with you. And if not, it's not because they're bad kids. There's nothing, no one's at fault for any of this, but it's a very, very serious issue. So what the digital media do is they interfere with what the children need. They're left with the superficial alignment to each other instead of that deep alignment to a caring adult in so many cases. And as I said, that leaves them psychologically malnourished. And unfortunately, this is a different aspect of addictiveness, because this is not the addiction I was talking about with interactive media that is hitting your child's dopamine receptors, but the way your children can connect to each other without actually getting that deep level of alignment they want, that's addictive in its own right, because it provides a taste, but it doesn't satiate. And that's why you get kids for hours, texting back and forth, yo, what's up, and these silly things, but they're not satiated. They're not able to move on and meet a higher need, and that interferes with everything, including their social emotional maturation. So why does it matter that they also can entertain themselves? Well, that in itself has an effect on their maturation. It affects their creativity. And again, I will go into just a few high-level things about maturation, because I think this stuff, really my goal with this presentation today is to get you excited about the fact that you can make the digital age the best time ever to parent, and stay away from the huge pitfalls that parents all around you are falling into. But you do have to know more. So I'm hoping to inspire you to keep learning on this journey for sure. So maturation, there's so many things like that I could say about maturation, but one of the main things I want to leave you with is that we get so confused. We nowadays are very clear that our children are not maturing like they should and they used to. We can't count on it anymore, we feel. And of course, we can actually count on it if we get our children back into alignment and into basically that village of alignment, so that they are orienting to the adults in their lives, and definitely having kids in their lives, but not orienting to them in like kids so often nowadays are orienting to kids and seeing the parents and the adults as superfluous and the ones to resist. Maturation is cultivated. So when you've got the right conditions, which is entirely what a gardener looks for, is right conditions, it's cultivated. It's not sculpted. It's not, so even so much of we're trying to teach caring top down by telling kids what to say, whereas caring is something you should evoke with the right conditions. Caring is spontaneous, and again, so many crazy examples I can give you of children just put in the right conditions. We'll jump into caring and jump into naturally acting as if they were the parent because of their natural instincts being evoked, not taught. So it's about raising and bringing something to its full potential, you know, and you do that by nurturing the roots, nurturing the soil and the conditions. Digital consumption, unfortunately, can dramatically undermine those conditions because, again, you know, that crazy thing, two loving parents in a house with one or two children can have children who are not actually feeling their parents' love, right? And it's basically like a blocker for sunlight, that the sunlight's there, your love is there, and your knowledge, your wisdom, all the things you want to teach your children are there. And unfortunately, screens can literally act as a blocker for that sunlight if your child is not able to keep in alignment with you. Maturation is also spontaneous, but only when the right conditions exist. And unfortunately, the right conditions nowadays are more abnormal than normal. There's lots of issues with, and so many things that one of the authors I'm going to mention at the end that you may want to check out more, Shirley Turkle. I've been reading one of her latest book, which is about conversations and how it's insane because if you take your kids, for example, you give them a digital free camp experience, or you take them camping or different things like that, spontaneously they will reorient to the adults in their lives. They will start like things like empathy, that there's a lot of very concerning studies about dramatic decreases in empathy nowadays. And I was thinking of a situation where she was called into a middle school and they were showing like 12-year-olds just showing complete lack of empathy and lack of an ability to even see what the world could be like through someone else's eyes, which is essential for empathy, because the right conditions were not there. Now, it's the fun thing about maturation being spontaneous and natural when the right conditions exist is that's why it's never too old to grow up. So you actually, many of us, and I certainly am one of them, I've done dramatic amount of my maturation happened after having kids and getting brought to my knees and having so many issues. Now, unfortunately, nowadays, there's so much going wrong with kids being out of alignment that many parents who start parenting quite mature, unfortunately, are brought to their knees too, and finding themselves, you know, screaming and being inappropriate with their kids because their instincts are all off and they don't know what to do. But the fact of the matter is, if you are clear that you've got some reasons why you didn't mature properly, you are never too old to grow up. One of the interesting things though about maturation is that it's very important that you have play time. Play is a child's work, no question. And my first and still foremost parenting mentor, who I was blessed to be able to literally be one of his first group of mentees, Dr. Gordon Neufeld, talks about how serious play really is for children and how critical it is. But the interesting thing is it's play actually with a twist, because your child has to bring the imagination. Now, I'm going to say a little bit about gaming later, because there's some hugely positive things that until recently I wasn't even aware of with gaming. But the problem is gaming is often introduced way too young to brains, much like drugs and alcohol. Well, alcohol particularly is something, because I definitely don't advocate drugs, but alcohol is something that an adult brain can take, and an adult brain in moderation is able to not get dysregulated as quickly, and an adult is actually much less likely to become addicted. Kids who start drinking in their teens are much more likely to become alcoholics than those who start later. And so even though there are some examples, you know, there's some ways for sure that you bring your imagination to a video game, it is a different type of imagination. And for your child, who has these high dopamine receptors, unfortunately, that type of play gets them into, really potentially gets them into a lot of trouble quickly. And it's like there's lots of people who started drinking as teens and did okay, but you're playing some Russian roulette there. And they actually are showing that video games are more addictive than alcohol. I've seen studies talking about that as well, right? So play with a twist. Your child needs play. They also need, though, and this is the kind of double whammy. So I talked a little bit about, yeah, video games, there's some imagination, Minecraft or something like that. There's some imagination involved for sure. But here's an interesting part that does not happen with online games. And again, we're talking about games. If you are already a mature being and you are playing online games, you're in a different place than your kid with their developing brain. With their developing brain, play has a strong partner in maturation, and that partner is actually boredom. Your child needs to have some times of out and out boredom. And well, the more properly they're maturing, the less they actually will go there, right? Because they know how to fill that hole, that hole with activity, with creative self-generated activity. And again, this is a lot of information borrowed from Neufeld and its developmental psychology, and based on how our brains develop and mature. And the fact of the matter is, it's another way that screens really affect our children's ability to experience times where they have to fill everything in instead of being able to plug into a game or plug into something online. Deepest joy in life comes from being self-actualized, right? And being able to make things happen in our lives. And digital use can be like having cookies. It's fine after we've had our meal, right? But we need to eat first. And the fact, again, that adults are just have so much, because we have the fully developed prefrontal cortex, we can make decisions around cookies that our children, if left to their own devices, they would be malnourished as well. And it can be, as I said already, like sex and alcohol. It's one thing for an adult, it's a complete other thing for a child, and it's just their brains are not hardwired and ready yet to deal with those things. And we have got so caught by media's newness. So the other thing to mention, and this is going to feed into something that's really critical with technology, is having limits. The role of limits, because that's another partner in maturation. And the interesting thing is that in order to have limits, you have to be willing to and understand the importance of your child actually being brought sometimes to tears. Like, it's not like you're trying to make your child cry, but when you set a limit and your child's sad, it's the healthiest thing that could possibly happen is for them to burst into tears, because physiologically that wires their brain for accepting the thing they cannot change. And one of the reasons we have a lot of aggressive kids nowadays is we have kids who are defended against their tears. And as I mentioned, there's lots of other things. When you've got kids with these low frustration tolerances and all that, then it's really a painful situation. Those kids, if they can also be encouraged to have their tears, and I'm not going to get into with aggressive kids that they've got a lot of defenses often against having their tears, but if they can have their tears when they cannot have something, it makes them dramatically more resilient, dramatically more able, ironically enough, to change things in the future. Because if they can accept that in this moment they can't have something, they can go on to try and change it. But if they get stuck in that moment and stuck in the fact they can't change it, we mistakenly think a lot of kids are strong-willed nowadays, when the fact of the matter is they are weak in the sense that they can't move on. And true strength is the ability to move on, but then say, this is not what I like, and change things in the future. Anyways, lots more I can say about that, but I wanted to just say that alignment gives your child psychological rest that's necessary for maturation. So this is a talk on digital issues, and it would not be a foundational talk. Like, I would really be omitting the most important thing if I didn't talk about the fact that there is this force that is supposed to make your parenting dramatically easier, and that digital issues are making worse, but connecting and working on learning how to align with your children and harness this force is a huge part of the way out and the solution. So the upshot is that given that maturation is spontaneous with the right conditions, it means that kids who are free of addictions and with their basic need for alignment met, they have a natural drive to want a life. Or in other words, failure to thrive is not an issue if right conditions are met. So nowadays we're so, I never criticize helicopter parents because parents are helicoptering because you're worried and you see that things are going wrong, right? But when you understand that maturation is supposed to be and is spontaneous and inevitable with the right conditions, then you don't have to worry about failure to thrive. You just have to worry about getting the right conditions. And you don't have to do the equivalent of pulling the plant out by its roots, right? Because when we see that they're not growing right, we end up tugging on the leaves instead of nurturing the roots, right? Okay, so much more I could say about that. But why does it matter? The last point, why does it matter how much that they can access information instead of getting information from us? Again, they aren't dependent on us. Once upon a time, to be old actually was once to be revered because of all the knowledge that we had. And it is, teaching is supposed to go top down, alignment is supposed to be hierarchical and it's supposed to lead to adults who are independent and equal. But when our children are not dependent on us and when they're often teaching us, it kicks our alignment out. Now, we can work with that, but it is a huge issue. And it's crazy because this is happening all over the place, because another example is food. Food is meant to be a powerful alignment tool. That's why family dinners are so important and things like that. And even if you can only eat together once a week, like really work on making sure you're doing that as much as you can. I just want you not to get anxious, because you being anxious is not going to help anything, but do make it important as many times as you can to have family meals together. But yes, our children, that they can give themselves information, they can give themselves food, they just don't depend on us in the same way. And as I was just talking about, it's supposed to be hierarchical, so when our children are teaching parents, it's out of whack. So all of this line adds up to, if you think of alignment like lots of different threads on a rope, that you can have a number of them can let go, but eventually if you have enough let go, you just lose the alignment altogether. So just going to touch briefly on our own digital issues, because I know that is also causing a lot of problems. So when we're talking about kind of the state of where things are at, our digital issues is part of it for sure. The present of your presence is one of the things that gets damaged right now in our modern age, with parents having so many issues with being on technology all the time, that our kids, speaking of that eye contact, that goes along with electronic screen syndrome, our kids aren't literally seeing our eyeballs as much as they used to, and not getting that gift of our presence as much. You don't have to give your kids 24/7, and you don't have to give them even the majority of the time. They don't have to have your presence, but they need your presence some of the time, and for most families more often than kids are getting nowadays. So examining and talking about your own tech use, looking at whether you're modeling comfort with boredom yourself and with having solitary moments, and seeing if you've got issues with limiting your own use. And if you do, the electronic screen fast may be something that you want to consider for you as well. So we'll dive into some on the how to harness the positives. I'm going to talk a bit about the gifts of the expanding digital world, and I'm only going to highlight a couple things that I think are more new to some people. How to protect against the pitfalls, and a bit on limits and technology. So the gifts of the expanding digital world is you can reach others and solve problems in a way never possible before, right? And even the fact we're here right now, right? So and that you can get help. So yes, parenting is crazier than it ever used to be, but without a doubt, if you're able to get help and get on this way less traveled, it's also by far the best time to be a parent, I argue. Technology exists to dramatically expand your child's learning and I'll say more about that in a moment. But there's so many examples in the classroom. There are some fabulous examples of technology dramatically expanding what your kids can do. Marina Bears is somebody who talks about, she's got a great talk called Playgrounds, Not Playpens, and she gives some examples of really specific technology that are in effect a playground, right? So that your child are learning and growing, and as opposed to a playpen, which is kind of the passive media, is more of a playpen. The playgrounds that she's recommending though aren't actually online games because of developmentally what's going on with your children. So a couple examples she gives, and I know it's nice to have some specific things to go away with. So she has been part of developing Scratch Junior and Kibo. She has a company that has developed some different technology that are just like crazy examples of how classrooms and individuals can put their kids in on educational courses where they can be learning how to develop and how to code, and really crazy benefits for your children. Now, I said I would say a little bit more about the benefits of gaming, and the purpose of introducing a little bit on the benefits of gaming is because those of you who have teens, and or those of you who either yourself or are married to somebody who games, gaming is not the blanket negative that many people think that it is. Huge caution is age appropriate gaming, and really watching the age that you're introducing things to your children. For those of you who want to check into this more, and I am going to give a more of a list at the end, but Jane McGonigal has a book called Super Better, really profound, fascinating. And basically the fascinating thing is that researchers on gaming have been discovering for a number of years is that you can develop a much more positive mindset because of online games. It's actually crazy. She talks about having a gameful mindset and learning to harness that gameful mindset, which playing online games can just naturally teach you, or you can consciously try to capture those attitudes and develop that mindset. But huge benefits for people who have medical conditions, depression, anxiety, divorce, like you name it. It's that gameful mindset can be really powerful, really helpful. So your children, as they're getting older, playing some games with you, and having that be a family thing sometimes can be a positive experience, but you're going to have to watch for the pitfalls and definitely be really careful about age appropriate introduction of games. The key, interestingly enough, that separates those who become addicted gamers in a negative way, and again, we're speaking not of children, some games that are appropriate for teens and older, but the key is to teach your child not to do it for escapism, not to escape their real life, but to have it something that augments their life. And definitely, whatever age, watch how much time yourself or your children are on games. So I want to introduce a little bit on gaming because I know that that's a massive concern, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the section about what to do about when your kids are addicted or somebody is addicted. So the great news is you can guide your children into responsible use, and I argue that it's actually one of the most important things that you can do for your children nowadays, because it is a huge competitive advantage. How your children interact with screens is going to be, and I've heard people talk about like the digital divide, right? Because it's much like things like nutrition. Those who eat really poorly and don't take care of their health are on a completely different path, and the same with media and digital issues. Total game changer in terms of your other goals. You want kids who have social skills, who are good with other people, empathetic, caring, etc. You need to really be careful with this. Academics, motivation, earlier I talked about like careers, long-term relationships, etc. All of those are dramatically affected by your successfully navigating the digital world. So a little bit about protecting the pitfalls. You need to nurture alignment. You need to have strict limits on media time. You need to use media to connect with your kids and connect them to others in their lives. Watch for peer orientation, and I'll talk more about all these things in a minute, and more about that in particular. And watch about what we share about our kids. So I'm going to go through this quite quickly because we're getting to, I want to make sure I've got good amount of time still for questions as well, and so you can ask me in the Q&A to go into something a little bit more. I do know we have lots of questions coming in, so I'll see how many I can get to. But yes, so nurturing alignment, basically what I want to leave you with is that when you understand the importance of making sure that your child's looking to you for connection, and like I said, I really can't get into that in this presentation, but I will make something available to you, another presentation I'm writing. I'm not 100% sure if my how to get kids to listen, learn, and love life is available online, so I can look at making something available for you as well. But the fact of the matter is it's the key to protecting your kids from serious online issues like sexting and predators. That kids who are, and bullying, for example, like the list could go on and on of how protective alignment is. When they've got that strong line, that strong connection with you, they will naturally even turn to you when they're starting to have problems. As opposed to, you know, the kid who's 4 feet away from their parent and messaging with somebody who turns out to be a 35-year-old predator and things like that, right? When your child, and then they're maturing properly, and then you've got children who their emotions signal to them that things aren't right here and I should check with my parent or get some help, right? It's just crazy how effective and how powerful it is. Definitely you've got to deal with your issues, right? You want to protect against the pitfalls of the digital age, deal with your issues too. Make sure that you are nurturing your own maturation and your own creativity, and showing your children that it's possible to love some time alone without media and things like that. And I'd love to say just a little bit more about why we're so glued to our phones, because I'd want us to be not critical of ourselves. First off, everyone expects us to be, whether it's for work or personal reasons. I just had this morning where I had my phone off for an hour and you know, got a number of texts from somebody who really thought that I should be on my phone, right? And our kids sometimes can be those people, or coworkers, whoever. A herd mentality. It's very normal to get wrapped up in what everyone else is doing. It's also a way to get beamed up, and I really want, that's why it's so important that you understand that some of the reason why things are so hard nowadays is because alignment is off. And so alignment's off, it's like gravity's gone and suddenly everyone's bouncing around and we're upset and angry. Get some help. You know, we're finding it so hard to be with our kids, but we need to make a conscious choice, and we need to make sure we get help for our parenting issues. We cannot any longer afford parenting techniques that work in the short term, because so many of the parenting techniques out there actually knock your kids out of alignment, and you're at expensive alignment. So massive issues too. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of getting help with parenting issues is massive issues with way too high standards for ourselves. So I talked about firm limits and, you know, restrict limits. Take screens out of the bedroom, period. I've not ever read anything and that has suggested that that is positive. There's even issues of the blue light on screens mimicking daylight and causing sleep issues. So very, very firm limits about not having screens in the bedroom. Age appropriate amount of time on the media, and age appropriate is not necessarily cut and dried, because sometimes as I said earlier, the electronic screen syndrome can affect kids. Some kids are needing even less media than others, right? And others are more mature and are able to deal more, but you need to have kind of age and developmentally appropriate. Definitely monitor what media they use, because it does matter. Definitely protect things like family dinner, and you should have a number of times, and if you don't now, institute some times that everybody has their devices off to the side, as in not even on the table and not accessible. And you want to have lots of discussion, especially as your kids get older, about media. You want to make sure that they are aware of why you have limits, and that they've got some input into it. That makes a huge difference in their willingness to work with you as well, right? And it's also really important that the lots of discussion with kids, that can include you being really clear when you're talking with them, that one of your roles is to help them navigate some of the conflicts that they will have, for example, on social media, right? And not solving their problems, but discussing things with them. Another thing that I love about media, and that we often are not harnessing enough, is using media to keep our kids close, not just to us, but also to extended family and other people in your life. Sometimes it's pseudo aunts and uncles, but people who become part of their alignment village, and that's something really important, and we are often not doing as much as we could nowadays. So that is one of the positive things, and many parents want to get media in order to have their child be able to message them. The interesting thing is that you've got to be careful that if you introduce media too quickly, and screens, and you end up having a child who starts becoming peer-oriented, then that device gets used against you. So really be careful about when you introduce it, but definitely using media to keep your kids close with you is really important as well. So I want to share a surprising alignment tool, and again, this is something that is for older children, but something that really can be used to keep those extended family and extended people of importance to your children and to you closer to you. Online games. And this is fascinating. I have not been somebody who's ever advocated, prior to doing a lot more research in this area, that you get into more that you get into things like the Words with Friends, that Facebook game, or Candy Crush Saga, or the farming game, some of those games. The fascinating thing is, those of you who've heard me talk more about alignment, you understand that the problem with the reason why our children's love doesn't get through when they're in the same house as us, if they're in alignment and seeking alignment from friends and not from us, is because it's like there's no line open between you. It's like you're talking and they're literally not, the words are not coming into their ears. So the interesting thing about online games is that that's a way for your child, or you even, to have more interaction with someone else. And there's some really fascinating information about, so the importance of playing some of these games with your kids as they start to get into the world of gaming, for example, of whatever level of gaming they get into, but whether it's little things like this, as it's developmentally appropriate for them to start doing those things, you doing it with them creates a crazy amount of alignment and does a lot for syncing your, for increasing your empathy for each other and increasing your connection with each other. So in Super Better, Jane McGonigal, Kelly, her sister, is also fascinating, but Jane McGonigal talks a lot about this, and it's really fascinating information. So something else I want you to be aware of. I mentioned earlier, peer orientation. It's your children having friends is great, important, nothing wrong with it. Although that being said, your child having very few friends does not mean that they will go on to not have a normal, healthy set of friends and social relationships when they're older, because they really need the most important connection, most important alignment is with you. The issue with kids becomes when they are more oriented, more aligned with each other than you, and there's many ways to tell that. But if you listen to children's music, for example, when you hear children who have listened to a lot of angry music, those are children who are frustrated because their core alignment needs aren't met. It's one of the deepest, most important needs in a human being. And children who are well aligned with their parents, for example, do not go there. That's just because they don't have that same foul frustration, and alignment frustration is really core, so it's very massively frustrating. So you want to keep an eye on whether your kids, for example, if they resist contact with you and just want to be with their friends, things like that are cause for concern. And much like you can do a electronic screen set, there are ways that you can do, even with kids who are very peer-oriented, there are ways actually to get a reset going to get them more aligned and to get them aligned with you again, and then kind of reintroduce them. Part of the problem with social media is that it ends up being like school forever, 24/7 school. So instead of going to school till 3:30, they come home and they're still connected. They're still in school. It's interesting because in Chinese, the word for their equivalent of Facebook is school forever. And as I said, it's friends are fine, but it's when the child's main relationships aren't with the adults that it's a concern. So if you've got a child who's resists contact with you whenever they're around their friends, or their friends don't want to even say hello to you, don't want anything to do with you, that's a sign peer orientation's an issue. Other kids, as I said before, they cannot give their deepest needs, which include unconditional love. And unfortunately, that's why your child gets the psychological malnourished from being peer oriented. And again, it's addictive because you get the promise of that deep need for alignment being met, but it's not actually met, and so your child can't rest. They don't get psychological rest. They have to keep trying and trying and trying to prove that the alignment is there. So you want to be really careful. Don't push your children on social media if they're trying to overcome social issues. The last, I said I'd talk a little bit about limits and technology. Definitely, assuming that you're protecting against the pitfalls already, I'm going to give you a couple things to think about in terms of when to introduce technology. If you've already introduced the technology, I am going to recommend that you check out Victoria Dunkley's book, because she's got some great information on doing a reset and how to go about something like that. So you may be in a situation where you want to do a bit of a reset in your family if you have introduced technology and you're already noticing problems. Are they mature enough? Like, that's a real question that you want to make sure that your child, maybe they are, other kids their age are on media, but do they actually have the skills? One of the questions is, do they have conflict skills? So kids who get onto social media, it tends to exacerbate who they already are, right? So if they have problems with conflicts, it's just going to increase the opportunities for conflicts because of even that 24/7 aspect of social media. And that's where your limits are so key, because you can help your children have some rest from always being in that kind of shark pit or whatever, shark pool. Training wheels are really important. That there can be a period of, maybe it's even a year or so, where your child is on your phone some of the time, right? I really encourage you to go with the, work through your mixed feelings about that, because you might wish that you had your phone more, but this is precious time, because your child, once they do get on media, you will lose some of the time with them you have now, and that can be fine. That can be part of them growing and evolving. But if you can just remind yourself that this will happen soon enough. Training wheels, the advantage is that literally if they're using your screen, you can see what they're doing that much more easily, right? And help guide them. Ask them questions about the technology they want to go on, and ask for positive and negative examples of people they know who are using the technology. And some of these ideas come from an interview and the research I did with the interview for Deborah Hettner. And she's got some great work on how to, and is very, pro technology. And you have to know how to work with the technology to avoid the pitfalls. So ask yourself, and your child, why do they want it? Because as I already said, it tends to turn up the volume on what your child is already like. So if you've got a child who's having issues with not knowing how to interact with others, it's not going to be a magic cure. And in fact, it can make things worse. So when not to give technology to kids, definitely not just to overcome social issues, as I've already talked about. And I already said this, but because of that fact that it turns up the volume on what they're like. You really want to look at limiting the social media. In the first place, you want limits, but you may even limit it more if you're noticing that your child is finding it painful. And you also may need to help them to actually find friends, right? And just like if there were no technology options, you would help your child find things to do with their times and find some interests. Of course, you want to give them some time to figure it out. Give them some time that's genuinely theirs to just fill, and then theirs to figure out what to do with. Our overstructured, over-committed, after-school activities become a real problem too, that adds up to problems with maturation and with alignment as well. But you may want to and need to keep your child off media and instead help them find friends in person, and or if they're online, maybe help them navigate and find a forum of people like them online, because sometimes that's very, very positive, that you may have like a budding actor and not many actors in their life, and sometimes you can help them find like-minded groups online and things like that. Watch really carefully to see if it becomes positive for them or not. And you'll notice I don't get into digital kind of monitoring software. There are times where that can be used fine and healthily. The fact of the matter is, though, you're much better to have your biggest emphasis on having kids who are well aligned with you, because then they'll listen, for example, and respect the limits that you set that much more easily, and not try and sneak, because there's so many issues with kids sneaking around the controls that parents have, and too much reliance of parents then on a technology that can be got around. You may want to actually have your child's passwords, particularly when they're younger and you're introducing them. That's really appropriate. The thing again is that you don't want to rely solely on this stuff, because they can just start another profile, right, at someone else's house or things like that. And definitely delay when in doubt. That's why I said, even with the training wheels, like longer waiting, there's rarely a con really to waiting. And it's fascinating. So homeschooled kids are highly sought out by college and universities because of their maturation and because of how much they've learned, and many of them have much less technology than other kids. So it is okay to have a family culture. It's okay to have kids where you empathize with them. But yeah, in our family, we don't play Minecraft at 8, and just say, yeah, I'm sorry, I get that your friends do, and then help them deal with options for what to do with their time, and even options for ways to connect with other kids, because a lot of times with suggestions for offline things to do, the other kids will participate as well. Anyway, some tools, just high level to mention a couple specifics. One is I highly recommend, and this is an idea from the Screenagers movie, and I will put that up here right away. Delaney Rustin she's another doctor who's done a couple documentaries, and one of them, Screenagers. Highly recommend you bring it to your school or community. That's the only way to get to watch it, but you can sponsor having it come in. And there's information on screenagersmovie.com about how to do that. She talks about having Tech Talk Tuesdays, and it's a great idea because dinner time conversations are so important for your child's alignment. And having those conversations, if you've got every Tuesday, you're going to talk about technology. It's a great way to deepen your alignment with your kids, to get to know where they're thinking, and to monitor yourself and everyone else in the family. And you can encourage your kids to comment about your technology as well. I do recommend you consider an electronic fast for you and your kids, and that's Dr. Victoria Dunkley's concept. It can be just really, really powerful to try that. And basically you get a reset, and then you can notice if some of the issues you're having. In a lot of cases, people do find that the issues dramatically improve when they reduce their, do an electronic fast, and then you can slowly introduce it again. Removing screens from bedrooms, I already mentioned, but it's just so huge because you do not have control over technology if it's in your children's bedrooms. And websites like Common Sense Media, and there's others, but that's definitely a great place to check, because asking other parents what they recommend and what their experience is can be really helpful as well. And Common Sense Media has a lot of information for you. So what to do if your kid's already addicted? This is going to be really quick, in part because of time, and I know there's danger if I'm putting too much into this, but I really want to give you a nice overview. Briefly, signs of someone who's addicted and options if it's an issue. So signs of addiction include lack of interest in other activities, constantly talking about or getting distracted by technology, mood swings and argumentative behavior, and you'll recognize a number of the electronic screen syndrome symptoms. Withdrawal symptoms, basically if your child's that much more moody and argumentative, and that you really notice it's when they're not on the media. Line sneaking, trying to get more time. Huge issues with that. So if your child already has an issue, a couple recommendations: always work on the alignment and find out more about that, because ultimately there's been a wonderful TED Talk going around lately about the core root of addiction, that if you deal with alignment issues in adults, addiction issues become dramatically easier to resolve, because they're showing a direct link between lack of alignment and addiction. Find ways to get your child input on the limit, because most cases, if you've got a kid who's already addicted, they're old enough to give you some feedback, and that is a deeply bonding, deeply aligning thing to do, and will help you find a solution that considers everyone's situation, everyone's feelings. Definitely consider implementing an electronic fast. And I also recommend, if you've got someone who's a gamer in your life, that you get the book Super Better and check into it, because it's fascinating that there are ways to get somebody who is an addicted gamer to actually turn things around by applying ideas from Super Better. And she gives examples of teens as well. And in some cases, the crazy thing is there are actually professional detox centers nowadays. That's how serious this is. So what I covered was why digital issues are so important, some of the reasons, some of the ways to harness the positives, and some things to do with your kids who are already addicted. And just a couple key points: that it is all about the relationship or alignment. You don't want to send your kids hungry to school. You don't want to have them hungry at home. So you want to make sure that you're not having that blocking effect, so that screens are blocking your ability for your love to get through to your children. The value of one caring adult for insulating and protecting your children against all sorts of challenges that the online world is exacerbating and creating. And remember that digital issues can rob you of your child. They can stunt maturation, or they can be a tool to keep your child close, to pique their curiosity and really open up the world for them in so many crazy good ways. So this, I'll put this up at the very end, which is in like 2 more minutes, but a couple recommended resources. Sherry Turkley has a number of talks and a couple books. Alone Together is one. I also had mentioned Reclaiming Conversation earlier. Highly recommend that. Dr. Neufeld, amongst other things, has on YouTube a video, Raising Children in a Digital World. Jane McGonigal's Super Better that I mentioned earlier. Dr. Victoria Dunkley, her book is called Reset Your Child's Brain, and it's a 4-week plan to end meltdowns, raise grades, and boost social skills by reversing the effects of electronic screen time. And fascinating, I didn't mention this yet, so I'll mention it here, that what she's found is that despite parents dreading and thinking it's going to be horrific to do the electronic screen time reset, that actually what parents find is the opposite, that it's much easier and that their children get just so much more cooperative so much more quickly. As I had said before, Screenagers, that documentary by Delaney Rustin, she's another doctor as well, medical doctor, and Dimitri Kostakis' TEDx talk, Media and Children, Common Sense Media Game Reviews. And I also wanted to add that you can go on YouTube to get gameplay videos and find out more about something that your child is interested in, and getting, having that discussion with them, a child old enough to ask to play something. In many cases, they're old enough to ask you, or to start advocating, starting to learn how to advocate for what they want, and you can ask them to describe why they think that game's going to be helpful, etc. So one more point is, definitely you need to be confident to the value that you are bringing to the table, because the crazy thing is you have the wisdom that they need. You may not have the specific knowledge, in many cases you don't, but you have the knowledge about what makes people happy, about what makes the world go round, that kids don't. And you acting confident is really important. You can keep learning and growing, but act confident of the value you give, because unfortunately our lack of confidence causes anxious kids. So I'm going to ask you one thing that you'll do differently now, and I'm going to turn to the questions, but I'd like you to put that into the chat. And as I said, I'm going to put the recommended resources up. This is not comprehensive in the sense that there are other things I did recommend. For example, Deborah Hettner's interview, and we should make that, and I will make sure we do make that available on my website near future, because she's got excellent work as well. So there are recommended resources that I didn't mention there, but those are a few of the main ones. So I'm going to, and there's going to be a replay available for over the weekend. So definitely do share this with anyone that you know who is interested. You can send them to greatparentingshow.com and they can opt in and they'll get the replay information, or you can send them directly to the replay as well. The advantage, of course, if they opt in, is they're going to get the reminder emails of it coming down, and they'll get information when Deborah's Hettner's interview goes up and different things like that. So I'm going to look back through the questions and take a few of them, and I would love to, as I said, though, please share with me at least one thing that you're going to do differently as a result of listening to this, because what happens when we take the time to do that is it can help us not go into overwhelm and instead start somewhere. Because the wonderful thing about alignment and about maturation is there's no need at all to get all of this right, that we just need to get heading in the right direction and just start the process of learning. And that's what this is about right now. So I'm going back through and glancing at the questions, and yeah, it's interesting. I love some of the comments about, having kids that are so addicted to computer games that they don't want to do real world things. I really highly recommend, Jess, in that case, that you look at the screen reset, right? An electronic screen fast, basically. And Gabriella, if you want to say what age your son is, I could give some comments about what's appropriate. And yeah, Deborah, like, it's crazy, but 6-year-olds do absolutely get addicted. And this is what's fascinating. And really, this is such a huge area to research. And so what I've done is brought, a number of the real key points to you, but it's fascinating how little amount of electronic time can trigger really sensitive kids and kids who otherwise have reasons to be more sensitive to media, right? And I'm sure that many of you found it fascinating to realize, as I certainly did when I first learned, that TV, my dad used to always call it the boob tube, and just like contemptuously talk about how you just sat there passively. But the irony is that sitting there passively is actually better on your child's brain, because they're not getting the same dopamine hit, so it's not as addictive. Yeah, so comments, about their kids wanting to be on a few minutes on a game to get bonus points. You know, really watch it. I highly encourage you to at least start considering the electronic screen fast. And one of the versions that I mentioned, and could have mentioned it on the tools too, is looking at having times like if you send your child to camp, I highly recommend that you pick a camp that has no like real strict limits about technology, right? And no technology, because it's crazy the benefits of this. Is again something from Shirley Turkle, is examples of kids and what they report when they go on these digital fasts, even for a week. So you don't have to do the digital fast in your home, but really start looking for opportunities to have time without screens and see the benefits. And then what's so rich is when the children start seeing the benefits, because then as they go on in life, if they've had snapshots of times where they've had no media, they're that much more likely to choose fasts of their own, or choose to limit their technology, as opposed to kids who have no idea, right? And oh my goodness, and yeah, porn is yet another one. Ray talks about porn, and amongst other things, when you've got kids who are, the deeper they're aligned with you, the more likely they are to bring it up to you, which is helpful. And it's really powerful to have some discussions with them. Now, of course, Ray, I really love that you mentioned this, or Ria, because you say you feel like you've failed in teaching the difference between right and wrong, impulse control and trust. And the fact of the matter is you have not. So drop that. Absolutely 100% drop that, because that is one of those examples of getting, we're caught flat-footed, right? We have no idea, even though we have an idea that porn exists. Almost every parent out there is naive about, until it happens to them, about how easy and how young it happens. And your child is just got normal, natural curiosity. And of course, the too bad thing is when they stumble across porn, it actually can lure them back, because it's this wild, different world, and they're interested in body parts. You know, 10-year-olds are still, they're not, she's very unlikely to yet be very hormonal in terms of, you know, very much in adolescence hormonally. So it's not about sex for them, it's about this curiosity that they naturally have, right? So definitely having discussions with her is really powerful, and making sure she also could have shame, especially depending on if you reacted, because most of us parents, you know, I have personal experience with this, and I know, you know, the fact of the matter is that our response often is to kick into shame, so then we overreact, and our children then can feel like they're really horrible. So just circling back and mentioning to your child that, wow, I'm really sorry that you kind of stumbled across that. It's not age appropriate. As your child gets older, something that is huge, and I have on the agenda I'm going to get on the show, is some people who talk about porn addiction and porn, but it's crazy. Dr. Norman Doidge is one who talks about the brain plasticity, and how with porn it's extremely damaging, because the plasticity of our brains and the dopamine hits actually make your brain want something more, and there's dopamine hits involved with porn, and it gets people down a horrible path. So that's a really appropriate conversation to have with kids as they get older as well. So I am going to keep flipping through, but great questions, great comments. And yeah, so Greg was asking, is there a difference between time watching television and time on the iPad, iPhone, computer? Absolutely. And the difference, though, is not what we typically think of, right? It's the opposite in terms of which one is more lethal. Now, interestingly enough, though, as I said, like online games can be powerful, and they can be positive as well. So that's important to know. But online games are that much more addictive than television, so you want to be careful about how quickly you're introducing those things, and definitely delay. So yeah, so interesting. A teen watching YouTube, it's not, you know, watching fashion tutorials and that is passive media. But now, well, Shauna, I have to tell you, first off, I'm going to give you my take on it. I don't know for 100% sure. My sense of it is that it's passive media, but it's kind of an in-between in that it's not as passive as TV, because they're getting to literally choose. You can change channels, but you don't have as many options for TV. But it is very similar, because you can have a crazy amount of channels and Netflix and all those different things. But again, not necessarily negative. And you want to watch YouTube, of course, can get kids where they don't want to go to, even unfortunately. Yeah, recommended and not recommended interactive media. Ali, you're asking about that. Common Sense Media game reviews is a great place to check, and you'll get a lot of more information about that. Katie's asking, wanting to know more about natural ways to evoke caring and compassion. I have a number of webinars that I've been delivering in person that I'm starting to deliver now online to the community, and I will do my Raising Caring Children in an, I can't remember my exact title, but it was along the lines of raising caring children in a world that can often be too cool and not as caring nowadays as it used to. But a lot of it, though, when you raise children with alignment in mind, you end up meeting a lot of the needs that result in them modeling after you, and then you being caring and compassionate is really critical. So alignment is the biggest thing that you want to get a handle on. And I talk about, I'll mention it just briefly now, but Dr. Gordon Neufeld talks about the crazy situation in Nazi Germany when many kids were estranged from their family and left to fend for themselves, and there were these boxcar children who were living out of boxcars, and the older children naturally, because of alignment and being in the right relationship, they saw that, hey, I'm older, I've got to take care of these little ones, would behave like parents and would do things like depriving themselves of food and things like that. So it's really crazy how powerful this is when you get everyone in right relationship. Ria's asking where to get more information on short-term parenting fixes that throw off alignment. I did say I will either deliver it in person or make a recording available of my How to Raise Kids Who Listen, Love Life, and who learn, listen, and love life, is another one of the talks I've been giving in person at schools that I will do online, and I get a lot more into that. And long and short, though, is a lot of the 1, 2, 3 magic and punishment-based parenting techniques. The more aligned your child is to start out with, the more they'll listen and the more concerned they'll be. But unfortunately, that knocks them out of alignment, and so they work short-term only. Yeah, so Irvin asks about suggestions, recommendations for software that monitors internet use, explicit sites, etc. And unfortunately, Irvin, I have over the years, I've even interviewed someone on these type of things a number of 4 years ago, but chosen because of how quickly things change and how many ways, if you're raising kids who are out of alignment with you, unfortunately, older kids anyways particularly, but nowadays older kids, like, everything's happening younger and younger, unfortunately they will find ways to get around those limits, because that can include just going to someone else's house and things like that. I even have a dear homeschool mom that I've worked with who, by harnessing alignment, is working on getting her teen to not sneak, because even with a child in your own home 24/7 or most of the time, it is unfortunately highly possible to still be accessing things that you shouldn't, right? So I don't get into that, and by all means, I'm not saying don't use them, and I do know people have given examples to me before of, for example, there's some systems that will time your kids out so that they know that they've got 20 minutes and bang, it's done, 20 minutes. That can be really effective, right? Because then you're not being the bad guy all the time, especially if and then you can empathize with your kid that their time's done, but especially when your child if it logs them right out so that there's no negotiating, that can be great. So it's not that I don't see any value, but that's why I don't get into that. I think that really covers the majority of the comments that were highlighted, at least read as the questions. And so I will gonna stop the screen sharing, and I will, though, as I said, I'm just taking a look here for the person with their hand raised. That's still from the beginning. So I will make some other presentations available. Would love to hear, if you haven't already, share what that one thing is you're going to do differently as a result of listening to this presentation. And I look forward to, like I said, I'm starting to do a lot more of my own presentations online, so I will to talk so kids listen, learn, and love life instead of rebel, tune out, and struggle. I'll do that talk for you online in the next while, and I also will do the Raising Caring Children presentation as well. Would love, though, to keep looking through. Oh, and on the greatparentingshow.com page, there are some past interviews, including my wonderful interview with Dr. Gordon Neufeld a year ago, and some other great interviews. So I really recommend you check out those resources in between. If you haven't already, join our Facebook page, greatparentingshow.com. So facebook.com, Great Parenting Show is the Facebook page, because that's a great place to ask questions and interact as well. And if you do post questions on there, I will definitely answer them as well. And I may jump on a Facebook Live, because I love doing those as well, and answer some of your questions there. So thank you, everyone. I see a question, Ray or Ria, hopefully I'm saying your name right. Go to greatparentingshow.com and you can sign in, opt in, and you'll get information on my upcoming webinars as well. And delighted to see everyone here. I'll end with one last thing. I was born in the States, grew up in Canada, and I'm sure that you can hear, sometimes people say they hear a bit of both, but at any rate, definitely a Canadian accent. And with my daughter graduating this June, I'm going to be speaking more and more in person. So if you want me to speak at your school or a conference, I am willing to, after this June, I'm willing to start traveling again to speak, which I love to do. But for now, as a single mom of a 17-year-old girl, it's made sense to work from home and stay close. And I've been really honored to be able to reach so many of you this way. But I do look forward to seeing more and more of you in person. So thank you, everyone. I will say goodbye for now, and I look forward to reading through the rest of your comments later. Take care. Bye-bye.